Welcome back to another Excel VBA series. So, what are we going to be covering today? Well, we're going to be talking about workbook connection objects. Now, just a little bit of a forewarning, definitely out of all the different VBA topics we've ever really covered, this is going to be a challenging one for some people just because it's a relatively complex topic. It's not necessarily straightforward, and a lot of times you have to work with a lot of different data sources, and those data sources can come in many different shapes and forms, and then naturally what's going to happen is that's going to change how you work with these particular connection objects. So I guess high level, when we think about a workbook connection, we kind of first have to understand, like, okay, well, what is it? Like, what is a connection? Well, it depends, because it really depends what version of Excel you're on. On older versions of Excel, there were basically these different types of connection objects that you could specify on your data tab. And so basically, if you're on a newer version, it's now considered a legacy wizard. But from there, basically, it was like your data wizard. It was importing your different types of connection objects, and it would range anything from a CSV file to a text file to a a URL. A lot of different stuff. And so basically, this was just a way where you could take external data sources and import them into your workbook, and then basically create a connection that you could refresh. So that was a great idea, right? You got some data externally, you can import it in, and you can refresh that data as it's changing, ideally. Now, what had happened is over time, these workbook connections kind of basically all got aggregated into this other engine called Power Query. Now, Power Query is I would say, the new standard of importing data. So anytime you import data into a newer version of Excel, so I'm basically saying 2013 and beyond. Does 2013 have Power Query? I think it's 2016. It was like actually built into the actual like ribbon and application itself. Regardless, in newer versions of Excel, you use Power Query. And Power Query is basically this mashup engine that helps you import different data sources and then transform those data sources so that way you can clean it up, maybe aggregate some stuff or combine different data sources. But the idea is that you use Power Query in order to import this data. So Power Query also lives under the data tab on your ribbon, but you can see we can import from a whole host of different types of data sources. And so this basically extended those kind of initial data wizard imports to other types of files: JSON, XML, databases, Azure, online services like Facebook, other sources like a table range, web, Microsoft query, a O data feed, ODBC, OLEDB. So just a lot of different data sources. And the idea is that we can work with all those data sources in a single application or single interface. So it's a great thing. So normally, anytime you record any type of data importing, it's usually going to have an associated Power Query formula that goes along with it. So that's basically, in essence, what it is. Really, when we're working with these connection objects, they're just basically representing connections to different external data sources. But depending on what type of version of Excel you're on, it kind of dictates what type of workbook connection you're going to more than likely work with 90% of the time. It doesn't mean you can't use older connection object types, but it's just not advised. Ideally, the reason is, you have this new engine Power Query, so you should be utilizing it. So the way this series is going to work is we're going to start our series off with just one connection. So we're going to start by importing an Excel worksheet from a different workbook using a non-Power Query method, and we're going to import it. And then in the second video, we're going to actually talk a little bit more detail about the connection object. But I think it's important to just have a connection to work with, import it, understand what that import process looks like. And then we'll start going through like, okay, so now we have a workbook connection. How do we work with those connections inside VBA? And then from there, what I'm going to do is we're going to be talking about an SQL connection. We're going to be talking about a CSV connection. And then we have text files as well. Now, I might add 1 or 2 more depending on how much time I can dedicate to this series, but there might be an extra 1 or 2, but at this point, just assume there's not going to be. So with that being said, let's talk about our first connection object. So the first type of connection that we're going to be doing is an Excel workbook. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close out my little Excel workbook, and I have another one. It's called Excel Workbook Data Source. And inside that wonderful workbook is a table called Sales Data, and it belongs on the Sales Worksheet. And then I also have another one called Employees Data, which is on the Employees Worksheet. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use VBA to import this data, but we're going to be doing it in a non-Power Query method. So we're going to be actually creating a OLEDB connection to a Excel workbook using VBA. So with that being said, let's jump into our developer tab. We'll go to our Visual Basic icon. And then if you haven't already, you want to make sure you insert a new module. And then from there, we can just create a new subroutine. I would call it something like, import Excel workbook. For me, I'm just doing video module because I'm going to be using this one over and over again. So I'm going to call mine video module. Yeah, that's fine. So let's begin this process. Well, what are the object variables we need to declare? So we need to declare our object variables. And in this particular case, we are going to first declare one object variable called workbook. That will represent a workbook object in the object model. We are also going to have a workbook connection object. And so this represents, connections. And this represents the connections collection inside of your workbook. Now, there are many different types of connections, like I've mentioned. So we just have to understand that this is everybody. And right now, when you basically create an instance of this, you will see every connection inside of your workbook. Now, if I want a single workbook connection, then I will do workbook connection. And then this will be a workbook connection object. Now, it's kind of funny because initially, I never really understood why you would call this one connections, but then you would call this one workbook connection. Now, we'll find that, again, there's different types of connections, but me personally, I thought it would have made a little bit more sense to call this workbook connections, just kind of like most other, collections in there. I'm sure there's a reason why they did that, but I just thought that was interesting where it's like, normally they're pretty good about following that rule, but for whatever reason, this one, forget about it. So from here, we're going to define basically a bunch of strings used for the connection object. And so this is going to range anything from building the connection string to giving our connection a name, a description, and even specifying certain queries and stuff like that. So the first one that we're going to be doing is the connection name, and this will be as a string. And then our next one is going to be our connection description. And as you guessed it, that one's a string. In fact, every single one of these is going to be a string. And so we're going to have connection string type. So this one is part of our connection string. It's going to define the type of connection it is. And then our next one will also be our provider. And so with our provider, this is basically specifying almost like, in a sense, the driver, if you want to think of it like that. And then from here, there's going to be a data source. So naturally, every connection we make is to a data source of some type. So we want to specify what that data source is. And then sometimes, but not always, we will have something called connection extended properties. It really depends what this is, but in essence, all you need to know at this juncture is that it's usually defining something about how we're reading the data in. It could even specify for in read or write mode or something along that nature. So that's really all it is. It's nothing too crazy, but it makes a little bit more sense when we're kind of there looking at it. And then finally, we're going to have our entire connection string. And then also, most connection strings are going to be having a query component, which basically defines how we're going to pull our data from this quote unquote table that's existing in the background. So now that we've defined all of our variables, let's first grab our workbook. So the workbook being the workbook that we're currently in. And so what that means is I want to use a special property, this workbook. So this workbook refers to the workbook that houses the code I'm currently writing. Now, remember that every workbook has a connections collection. So we're going to grab the workbook connections collection. There's a lot of opportunities here to have wonderful tongue twisters, because when you're saying collections and connections, it's all getting really fun. So I'm going to call my workbook object. If I start typing connections, you will see the connections property. This returns the connections collection. So now we have this collection of all of our connection objects. Now, personally, I never actually verified before I started this video. I'm sure I have some other ones. Oh yeah, I have some right here. Okay. I need to delete some of these, but we'll get there in a second. So these are basically just some of our data or some old stuff that I've worked with in the past. And so something I'm basically doing is just deleting all my old connections. But from the data tab, you can access the queries and connections is that section. And then there's a queries and connections button that you can press. And then this is basically where you can see all your connections and your queries from the same pane. You can also see it from the existing connections. And you can actually, if there was one here after, of course, I deleted it, you can right click and you can see some of the properties about that particular connection. And when we create one, we'll take a little bit more detail look at it. But this is basically where you're going to be managing all of your connection objects. Okay, so we have our workbook connections collection. Let's define some things about it. So define the connection name. So you can give connections a name. There's nothing stopping you. If you don't, it will just leave it blank. I'll call this one my Excel workbook connection for sales. So for my sales data. And then also I can define the connection description. And so this is just something where it's like if someone's looking at it, they're not going to go, hey, what's all this data doing here? This is supposed to give you some context as to what's inside of it. So a connection to my Excel workbook that contains all my employee and sales data. Okay. So just a little simple connection. Now comes the fun part, defining the components of our connection string. Every connection object will have a connection string. A connection string is basically the different pieces that we need in order to connect to that particular object. Connection strings can be a little bit intimidating at first because first time you look at it, it's a little bit foreign. You're like, what's going on? What does that mean? What does this mean? Take it one step at a time, and normally it's not too bad. So for a workbook connection, this is an OLEDB connection. OLEDB, I'm trying to say it correctly because that's very easy to slip up, is Object Linked Embedded Database. That's what it's short for. And it's basically just a framework that Microsoft developed many years ago that was basically used to help standardize importing of data, right? So it's basically a framework that was designed to take all these different types of data sources. And if you wrote it to that framework, you could import it easily into your application, whatever that application might be. In this case, it's Excel, but it can be used different places. But that's the idea behind it. It's just a type of connection that is from an older framework that was used to help standardize, grabbing data, basically. So when we define our connection, so define the type of connection, one of the things that we do is we define the connection type. And so the way we do that is we say OLEDB, and that's fine for right now. That's the first component. So we define the type of connection that it is. Sorry, I'm moving my notes. The second thing that we need to do is the provider. Now, sometimes our wonderful connections will utilize a driver. the type of driver you use depends a little bit on what exact version of Excel you're on. Now, I'm on the latest version, so we get to use, quote unquote, the latest driver. So this portion, we define the provider. This is basically the driver which we're going to be using to connect to that data source. And so we'll call this provider. Now, if I want to make an OLEDB connection, there's a couple different drivers that do that. But for the one that we're going to be needing for an Excel workbook, it's called Microsoft.ACE.OLEDB 12.0. That is the name of the driver. If you've seen my SQL series, we've used this driver before. This is the latest one. There is Microsoft Jet 4.0. That is for earlier versions of Excel. So if you're on like 2007, 2010, and I maybe think 2013, I can't say for sure. Basically what it is it's just the driver. That's all it is. It's just the driver, and it's just telling us how do we connect to that data source. There's many different types of drivers out there depending on what you're working with, but for an Excel workbook, for the newer ones at least, it's going to be Microsoft.ACE.OLEDB.12.0. Keep in mind, you must spell it exactly like this, or you will not be able to connect to it, and sometimes it will not tell you that it's because it's misspelled. So now that we've defined the provider, which is really just our driver, we're going to define the data source. So this is, where the heck is this data coming from? Well, in this case, it's just the file path. It's the path to the file. This will obviously change depending on the data source that you're working with, right? So in some cases, it could be actually a URL, or it could be maybe a server name or something like that. It really just depends. In this case, because we're working with an Excel workbook, it's going to be a file path. Now, I already have that file path ready to go because I can just right click, go to properties, and I'm going to move this over here, go to security, and I'm just going to copy that. Be a little bit careful sometimes when you copy this path, is sometimes there's a hidden character that will get copied along with it. And guess what? It won't work. And it won't tell you why it's not working, because it doesn't think anything's wrong. It just thinks that you're trying to provide a bad file path. Fun, right? Yeah, it's okay. Okay, so we defined our data source, we defined our driver, and we defined the connection type. What's next? Well, we've got to define the extended properties about this particular data source. This really is just dependent on what type of connection it is and the data source. Sometimes you're not going to have to define this. Because this is an Excel workbook, this is something we do have to define. But really all it's doing is it's just defining the type of Excel workbook we're going to be working with. And I think there's one other thing that we define about it. I'll have to look at it when I think about it again. So connection extended properties equals, very important, double quote, and then it has to be single quotes on the inside. If you do not provide the single quotes on the inside, it will not work. And guess what? It will not tell you anything's wrong. Now it's going to be Excel 12.0 macro. So this is basically telling us kind of the workbook that we're going to be pulling data from in. Usually Excel 12.0 is normally referencing the oldest one. If you want an earlier version, there are earlier versions for a, where is it? Let me just bring it up. What do I want to do? Excel connection strings. Sometimes it's just kind of easier to look at it because it makes sense. Honestly, I can't remember half the time because there's just so many out there. But with this one, so we're on ACE.OLEDB. There's 12.0. I think there's 8.0, and I think there's 4. Yeah, so there's 8.0. I think there might even be a 4.0. No, I don't think there's a 4.0. But also, this is kind of just, highlighting some. Remember I said that they're, for earlier versions of Excel. It's Microsoft Jet. That's basically that driver. So that's just for earlier versions of Excel. But again, for the most part, since we're usually working with, regular Excel files, we're going to be doing ACE. And then on top of that, there are certain things where if you want to connect to just a regular Excel file, then it's XML. But then if you want to do a binary one, I think, oh, it's still the same. Oh, that's still the same. It's macros that's different. So that one you have to specify macros at the end. And then 8.0 is for 97 to 2003 XLS files. So those are the older ones, obviously. And then they have this like a little extra thing at the end. So this is basically saying header. It's short for header. It's HDR. But if you set that equal to yes, what you're really saying is, hey, that data source I'm about to import in, it has a header row. That's all we're specifying. This one was interesting, IMX. To use IMX is a safe way to treat mixed data columns. Interesting. Consider the scenario where that one Excel file might work fine, might work fine, that causes that file data causes the driver to, oh, that was a tongue twister, to guess one data type while another file containing other data causes the driver to guess another data type. This can cause your app to crash. So I guess this is basically just saying everything's the general data type. So I'm not going to try to predict what type it is. So if you specify IMEX, it looks like that might help kind of alleviate potential for things of maybe crashing or something like that. Normally, I haven't run into any, I would say, major issues with that, but it is kind of good to know. So again, to finish off our extended properties, we are going to say, hey, yes, this is it does contain headers, so that's important. And then from here, we can build our full connection string. So build full connection string. And so we're going to say connection string equals, and then we're going to do connection string type. You know what, just to save some time, I'm just going to copy it. That, and I don't have faith that I'll type it all right. I hate building connection strings. It's like, I hate it with a burning passion because it's so easy to mess it up. So the first thing about our connection string is the type. Then we're going to specify our provider. Make sure you have the semicolon. You have to have the semicolon, and it has to look exactly like you're seeing it. Casing is important. Spacing is important. It's very important it looks exactly like it, or else it will not work. I can guarantee that. So you have your provider. This is just our driver. Our data source, which is going to be our file path. And then we have our extended properties. Note at the end, I close it all off with a final semicolon. Again, very important. It looks exactly like you're seeing there. And then from here, what I'll do is I am going to print it out so we can see it at this juncture. Did I not? Oh, that's right, because I didn't. Okay, let's try it now. Okay, so here is basically our full connection string. Normally, this is how they always look. So again, we start off with our type, our provider, our data source, which can be kind of long if you're looking at it, and then our extended properties. So it's just a big old string, but it's delimited with a semicolon that basically defines the sections of that string. And then from there, we're just kind of defining those different components. That's all it is. Again, connection strings are a little intimidating, but for the most part, you'll do them a couple times and you'll start kind of understanding like, okay, there is a recurring pattern. It's a little bit foreign, but it's not too bad. So now that we've defined our connection string, we do need to define our query. Our query is basically just pulling in the data. Now, because we're doing an Excel workbook, it's a little bit different, but it's nothing too crazy. So most of the time, it's usually some type of SQL statement. So we're going to define the query, and we'll just give it the name SQL query. We're going to wrap it as a string. And inside that string, we're going to do our select statement. We're going to select all columns from, and then it's going to be the name of the worksheet. So in this case, it's going to be sales. We put a $sign at the end, and then we put our closing bracket. So pull from the sales worksheet all the columns. Now, it is very important to specify here. There is nothing stopping you from just importing 1 or 2 columns. In fact, you can treat this just like normal SQL queries. You can have where statements, you can have a whole host of things. There is nothing stopping you from treating this like a normal SQL query. So it can be as simple or as complicated as you want. I would advise away from doing the really complicated stuff just because you don't have an SQL editor here. You're not going to have syntax highlighting. You're not going to have anything that's going to really understand what you're doing. But technically speaking, there is nothing stopping you from making a very complex query. It just is normal, in a sense, table. Like it just would be in a normal database. So again, you do have some flexibility, but just keep in mind, you don't want to go too crazy or else, you could pretty much dig yourself in a hole. So at this point, we've defined our connection string and we've defined our query. We now have all the information we need to actually create a connection in our workbook. Now, this is the crazy part. We did all that work and we still don't have a connection. This is actually the part where we actually define the connection object in our workbook. So create a new connection object in our workbook. So what we do is we take our workbook connections object. So collection. We're going to call the add to method. And then with this, there's a whole bunch of different parameters that we can define about it. 4 of these are optional. 4 of these are required. 3 of these are optional. The first one that is required, so you have to give it to me whether you like it or not, is connection name. So this is basically going to be the name of our connection. Now, if you remember up above, we've already defined that right here. So this is just our connection name. Let me get rid of that capital S at the end. Okay, so now that we've done that, we're going to do a space and then we're going to do an underscore. We'll go to the next line. Sometimes you got to break a line out because otherwise it's too much on one line. And then next we can give it a description. The description, kind of like we talked about up above, it's just describing what is this connection all about. Well, we have our description defined. We're going to put a comma, underscore, next line. And then from here, we're going to have our connection string. Our connection string is simply the connection string that we defined up above, that really complicated one, the one that took all the different little pieces and components. Additionally, we're going to have something called command text. Command text is really just your SQL query. Now, in some cases, it could be a little bit different, but generally, it's just going to be the SQL query, I would say, in most cases. Now, this is also a good time to let you know there are different types of command text. I haven't really found too many situations where I've gone to the other ones, but they are there. I guess maybe one of the next examples I can give you some descriptions about it. At this point, it's not going to really work with the Excel workbook, but the idea is, again, it's basically just defining the actual kind of query itself. Additionally, we do need to define something called the L command type. So this is telling us what type of command are we defining in this section up above. In this case, we have something called XL CMD SQL. Now you can see up here, there's command table, table collection, command Excel, default, cube, DAX. So there's a lot. There really is a lot. Unfortunately, I don't know necessarily what every single one does, but maybe at some point we can kind of go through that topic when we get there. Additionally, we're going to have something called create model connection. The create model connection is basically saying, do you want to create a connection in Power Pivot? So do you want this to be part of Power Pivot? In my case, I really don't want it to be. That kind of just, sometimes adds just a little bit more overhead that I really don't need. But you obviously could, there's nothing stopping you. But in this case, we don't really need it. And then also, in some cases, we might be importing from a database. We might be importing from something where there's been some relationships defined about my wonderful connection, and I might want to import those relationships. Now, in our case, my Excel workbook actually has no relationships, but you can define relationships in your Excel workbook. I've never actually had to import relationships. I'd be kind of curious. I mean, maybe in the second or third video, I'll kind of revisit this one and I'll see what happens when I do that. But just be aware that in some cases, normally for your typical databases like SQL Server, there is the ability to import the relationship directly into the workbook. So if we run this, hopefully it works. I do this all the time. I change my variable names, and I know I shouldn't. So there were no errors, which is good. It means it worked. But what do we have now? Do we actually have anything worthwhile? Is there anything like cool about this now? Well, we do. So right now, we have a connection. And so right here, if you were to go to your data tab and then your queries and connections, you would see like, oh, cool, there's this neat little connection, right? So if you want, you can refresh your connection. You could delete your connection. Well, I don't want to delete it because I just created it. And there's properties about my connection. So inside my properties, I can see the name that I defined about it. That's kind of neat. I've got my description. And then there's a refresh this connection on refresh all. So, these are just different properties we could define about our connection. We'll talk about that in the next video on how we can manipulate some of these properties. But really at this point, what I want you to know is that, there's different things we can set about our connection. They're not as static as you think they are. There's actually a lot you can define about it. Now, some of it also depends on the type of connection it is, but you can see usage. There's a definition. So this is defining the connection type. Sometimes there's a connection file. So if we're taking from an external data source, that might exist. There's a safe password property we could set about it. And then we actually have the connection string as a whole. So this is that fancy little complicated thing we were doing. This is basically what we were building and filling out. And then we also have our command type, which is SQL right now. There's table and default. There is select the query, and there's some authentication settings if we wanted to. So there's a lot you could definitely do about it. You can even export a connection file if you want, and then it's going to automatically go to your documents, my data sources. But, just say, for example, I want to go and put this on my desktop. What does it all look like, right? Is it anything fancy? Is it anything cool? We'll see what's all there. And then if it's being used somewhere, it will tell you where it's being used. So let's look at our wonderful connection file. It's right here. Normally, you can just open it with a text editor and it's fine. Notepad. So you can see it's actually just a big old XML file, really. But inside it, it's really just defining certain things about it. So for example, it's going to, content type, something like that. Program ID, source type, title. So that's the name. Source type, well, that's obviously just our type of connection. There is the description. There's the name again. Document properties. It doesn't seem to have anything. There is, I don't know what that means. There's another connection type. This is the connection string. And then the command type, command text. This is just the office data connection. Wow, there's actually a lot in here. I don't remember seeing this much in there, but maybe it was just me. And then interesting. So there's some kind of function that's JavaScript based that's getting the properties. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I've never actually used it, but I hope it doesn't did I just break it? Okay, good. I hope I didn't break it. I thought double clicking it might do something, but I guess not. Okay, so at this point we have a connection, but it's not in our workbook. We want it in our workbook so that way ultimately we can actually work with the data. It's not really useful if it's just kind of sitting in the background. So what we're going to do next is we're going to add this connection to our workbook on the worksheet that we specify. So here, we're gonna actually just copy some of the stuff up above, and we will call this sub and sub, and we'll call this video module import. So we're still gonna need a workbook. We're still going to need another one called worksheet. This will be a worksheet object. We will need something called XLS table. This will be a list object. So this will actually house all the data. Additionally, we can do XLS query table. And then this one is something called a query table object. And then we have our connections objects, our connection object. In this case, because we are going to be working with an OLEDB connection, I am going to create a specific type of connection called an OLEDB connection object. So we've defined all of our variables. At this point, I'm just going to copy some stuff up above, just again to kind of help save time. We're still going to need our workbook. We're still going to need our collections. But here we go. Now we're going to get the fun stuff. Grab the connection. So we're going to set, I'm going to put this down a little bit more. We're going to set our Excel workbook connection equal to our Excel workbooks connections object. There is an item method. It is not working. Why is it not working? Excel workbook connection. Oh, that's why. Workbook connections. There is an item method. You can either select a query by the order in which you added the query, or you can use something called the key method. The key method, it's really simple. You pass through the query name. So in this case, if I want to select it, I'm just going to grab what I have up here. So the key method is you specify the query name or the connection name. So this will grab the connection for us. At this point, let's kind of see what we get. So we have an Excel workbook connection object. You will see you can delete it. There's a description. So maybe, for example, I just want to print it out and see what my description is and something like that, right? Okay, so I can see my description there. That's kind of helpful. Maybe I need that. There's some other things about it. There is a in model. So this is if it's in the actual Power Query model. And then there's a name, ranges, refresh with refresh all. So that was kind of defining one of those properties we talked about and stuff like that. But here's something you're going to see. Data feed connection, model connection, ODBC connection, and then OLEDB and text and worksheet data connection. Like, what is all this stuff? Here's the fun stuff. This is actually the different type of connection object that we're working with. So to know which one to get, you have to know what type of connection you're working with. So in some cases, it's advantageous to call the type property because that will tell you what type of connection it is. And if you're ever confused, these are all the different types of connections there are. And from here, then you can decide, okay, I know what type it is. How do I go about working with it? So that's the important thing is sometimes you have to know the type before you can actually grab the connection object itself. You just kind of have to do it. Now, in this case, we were kind of lucky because we've created this connection. We should know which type it is. So I know it's an OLEDB connection. So I can just call that property. This will return the OLEDB connection object. So it returns its own object, which then has its own unique properties and methods associated with it. Now, because this is an object, I do want to make sure that I set it as an object variable just before I go and do anything else. And then, so here, grab the OLEDB connection object. So at this point, it was very ambiguous. We just said a workbook connection. We never specified what type of workbook connection. But at this point, now you are specifying what type of workbook connection. Now that I have that, I'm also going to set the worksheet I want to import the data into. So we're going to set Excel worksheet equal to this workbook. Oh, sorry, no, I can do Excel workbook. Excel workbook worksheets my underscore Excel file. Okay. Now comes the next fun part, which is we're going to create a list object on this worksheet. So a list object just representing an Excel table. And we're going to specify the source type, the connection, and the destination of this list object. So create a list object that will house all of the data. So we're going to set Excel XLS table equal to Excel worksheet. And then there is a list objects collection from which we can call the add method. And then with that, there's some properties we can define about it. Some cases we can specify certain things. In other cases, we don't need to really specify it. In this case, there is a property called, an argument called source type. In this case, because it is coming from an external source, a workbook, an external workbook is considered an external source. We're going to specify Excel source external. Additionally, excuse me, there is a source property. Now, here are where things get a little bit misleading. You would think, because the source is basically saying what is the data source it's coming from. Initially, I always thought, well, it's just the connection object, right? Like that is your source, because all the examples online said it's just the connection object. It's not the specified connection. So it's not the lower level one. It's actually still the high level one. If you do this one, it's going to create a second connection in your workbook that's blank. I don't know why, because you would think I should be able to specify this one. I think high level, what's going on is this is technically its connection where this one, I think, also has, oh, it doesn't even have that. I thought it would have something like, description or something. But basically, if you were to use the OLEDB connection, it creates a second connection that's blank, and then it just doesn't look right, because now you have two connections. One is really the one that has all the info, but now the one that's linked to your list object, it's like this other one. So we don't care about that one. So what we want is we want the Excel workbook connection. Very important you do that. And then finally, there is a destination. The destination is basically saying, where the heck do you want this thing to go? Well, I want it on my worksheet, and I want it in range A1. And then we're done. And I'm just going to indent that a little bit so it's a little bit easier to read. But that's all you do. You specify the source. So where is it coming from? The source, the source type. What type, where is, well, it's kind of a little bit missing. The type of source that we're working, is it external, is it internal, that kind of stuff. The source, so the actual hey, this is where it's at. And then the destination. So where do you want this list object to go? So once we've done that, we now have something that we can grab from this list object. And that is the query table. So what we're going to do next is we're going to grab the query table from the list object. So set Excel XLS query table that equals the Excel XLS table. And then it has a property called a query table. A query table is basically, it's like a worksheet table built from data that is coming from some type of external data source, such as, like a SQL Server, an Access database. It could be an Excel workbook in our example, but basically what we're saying is it represents a worksheet table where the data is coming from some type of external source. Now, in this case, because it's coming from an external source, it works out perfectly. So when we use the query table property, it returns a query table object that we can then manipulate. So we'll say with our query table, what do we want to do? Excel XLS query table and with, and there's a lot we can do with it. One of the things that we need to do is we need to define the command type. Define the command type. Because if you think about it, it's a table, and it's this table that's able to perform queries, so we need to define what type of query it can do. Well, part of that is defining the type, the command type. Well, what we can do is now we're going to work with our ACE.OLEDB connection, and then we're going to specify from that connection object the command type property. So that returns the actual command type. Now you could technically just, skip this part altogether and just do command SQL, but I want this to be dynamic. I want it to be linked to basically the connection that it's currently on, because in some cases our connection can change and then the command type can change. So I want to make sure that it's always referencing the connection that's going to be pulling the data from. So we specified the command type. Now we can do the command text. So define the command text. So we'll do the command text property, ACE.OLEDB connection. God, I hate saying that word. And then there's command text. So, and then, just so you're kind of aware too, there's a lot here. There's refresh on file open, there's save as ODCs, that's basically like exporting it, save password. There's just tons of stuff that you can set about it. I unfortunately haven't had the opportunity to go through all of it, but it just kind of shows you there's a lot to this object. It's a little bit misleading. You think it's simple, and it's actually pretty complex if you think about it. So now that we've done that, we're going to do something that seems a little bit reverse. So from your query table, you can actually reference the list object itself. So let's change the display name. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do list object display name equals Excel workbook data. So again, a little counterintuitive. Oh, I can access the same object that I grabbed this one from. You can. There's nothing stopping you. In some cases, that's advantageous. Now, from here, before I do anything else, because most of what I'm going to do next is just really formatting, I have to make sure the data is in there first before I do any formatting. Or basically what's going to happen is it's not going to really do anything. It's going to format it, but it's going to format the list object before the data has been imported, and I don't want that. I want it to format it after all the data's in there and stuff like that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull in the data. You would think it automatically does it. It doesn't. What you have to do is you have to call the refresh method, and then what I do is I set the background query equal to false. So this basically says, hey, refresh the data and then don't run it again until I do it. So you can actually specify where it runs in the background, like every 30 seconds or whatever. But in this case, I just want to run it once and then don't run it again until I do it. So now that I've done that, we're going to see the data. But from here, what I want to do is now I want to define some formatting. So the first thing is don't adjust column width. So we're going to say adjust column width, set that equal to false. Change the table style. So we're going to say list object, table style equals, and then table style light 21. This is like the light green one with black. I really like this one. I don't know why. And then set the refresh style. So what this means is, hey, as new data is entered in, like, what do you want to have happen? Well, it just basically means that when we insert new data, I want to follow insert and delete cells. So if data is removed, then delete those old cells. If there's new data to insert, then insert. There's also overwrite and insert entire rows. Most time, this is almost always what you're going to be using. The other ones are very, very specific use cases. Additionally, from here, I want to make sure that the data is readable. So I'm going to set all the rows to a height of 25. And I'm going to say dot list object dot range dot rows dot row height equals 25. And then I'm going to do the same for the columns. Excuse me. And then we're going to do list object. And this one was actually a little bit different. I don't know why I have it here, but apparently I'm doing data body range. Columns. And then there's a column width property. It's very important you don't call rows, then row. It's rows, then row height. So this is going to work over the entire collection. Set all the columns to a width of 20. And I think there's like other stuff you can do too, which is like data body range, cells, and then where is it? There's like a line, vertical alignment. There's stuff like that you can do. What I would probably do is I would probably just do this one and see maybe if that works fine. Again, I've never actually done vertical alignment, so I'm not positive if it's gonna work perfectly, but we'll see. So if I do dot vertical alignment equals Excel vertical I gotta look up the property. I can't remember what it is. VBA. This is normally what I do in my everyday life. I spend a lot of time here, more time than I should, but it's interesting stuff. So I'm working with a range object. I want the vertical alignment. XLV align. Oh, XLV align center. Control J, XLV align centered. Perfect. Make all the data aligned vertically centered. Maybe that's the way I should think about it. Okay, so here's the moment of truth. Hopefully it works. I hope it works. It's not gonna look good if it doesn't work. Nah, you guys are accepting at this point. See? Oh. It worked. Woo! The alignment didn't happen. Oh, no, I guess it worked. This worked, yeah. I just didn't align it correct. I should have aligned this one too. I'm very picky about like layouts and stuff like that. So of course that's like the first thing I noticed. But you can see that it has now officially imported the data. So now the external data that we have specified is now currently inside of our workbook. Now I do want to, again, just show you some stuff that, if you ever really wanted to do it, you could do it. There's nothing stopping you from doing it. But like I said, at a certain point, it really just, it doesn't make a lot of sense to make it too complicated. So for example, maybe I want something where year equals, or what is it, is greater than 2005, right? So greater than or equal to 2005, right? So before you run this again, there's a couple things you got to do. You have to first make sure that there is no table, because it will actually get a little bit mad at you. And then when you delete that table, unfortunately, what happens is it actually deletes the connection as well. So, just be aware that when you delete it, it will actually get a little bit mad at you. But hopefully now it will query it specifically like that. So that's kind of neat, right? So we're actually querying from a Excel workbook, but we're treating it just like we would from a SQL database in a sense. So that's kind of neat. I thought that was really neat when, you can do that and you can actually treat your Excel worksheets basically as just a SQL table, and you can, specify certain conditions about it. I've never really gone super complex. So I've never done things like, can you do like, I don't know, like a pivot or unpivot or something like that. I mean, you might be able to, but I've never actually done that, but I can't imagine you couldn't. But yeah, I think at this point, I've dramatically run over the time. Jeez. I was not expecting that to be an hour. So at this point, if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below. I mean, other than that, in our next one, we're actually going to work with the collections object. Sorry, the workbook connections collections object. We'll see how to loop through it. We'll see how to, get specific properties about certain connection objects and stuff like that. But yeah, this one went a little bit over, but it's a pretty complicated topic. I mean, there's a lot of different parts to it, and probably the most complicated out of all this one will be the Power Query one, just because with that one, it's just a little bit different. It's going to be different than pretty much all the examples we've done. But so yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below. Otherwise, we will see you in the next video.